Thank you so much, Lila, for coming here. And then, it's a huge opportunity for us Brazilians to have you and then talk to you. It'll be the first time that you're going to have vets and Brazilians as an audience. And then I thank you so much for coming here today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've always wanted to come to Brazil. And I know, I think Jothi Robertson has been to Brazil several times. She's a shelter vet, but she's been coming to discuss animal cruelty and domestic violence issues and things like that. So I've been very jealous of her. But
you needed to bring you there because you need your energy. And then it's very interesting because people in Brazil, especially as I'm going to go through the questions, I'm going to mention that shelter medicine is not very well known in Brazil. And then you're a huge inspiration for us, for everyone, that's when we discover that this field exists. Because when I graduated a long time ago, I was in 98. Was not it was started. It started in the beginning. It started going and going. Sorry, I'm so slow today. I got COVID and then I had this.
Oh no.
Yeah, I have the symptom that is still going. That's sometimes I cannot function
I had COVID, so I had it at the very beginning when it first kind of hit back in March of 2020. Okay. And I understand how it can totally knock you out of commission. Yeah.
Oh my God. But this is after 2 months, sometimes I have this post-COVID that I'm still struggling sometimes. It's not every day, but there are days that I'm okay, I cannot talk in Portuguese and English
I totally get it. And it sounds like you have what they kind of call long COVID, and where people still have fatigue and brain fog and all that stuff. I think I have fatigue and brain fog just because of my age. I'd like to blame it on COVID, but it's really not COVID. I retired 3 years ago, so I don't really do much more speaking. So I was kind of reluctant to do this, and especially since there's so many other younger people that are so on top of everything, and I'm sort of distanced from it. But I'm happy to, do whatever I can, and just hope that you, continue to do this with some of the people that are still actively involved in the field.
Oh, thank you so much, Lila. I'm going to start with the questions, and then I'm going to start with the first one. And let me know if you wanted to answer all the questions. Feel free to. I don't want to answer this question, feel free, and then I send you the question, let me know before I send you the questions let me know what you think. And then the first question is, could you tell us more about you and your mission?
Well, I always wanted to be a veterinarian from when I was a little girl. So it was like the fulfillment of a dream to finally graduate from Cornell, but I had no idea that there was such a thing as working in a shelter. It was something that was never mentioned when I was in vet school, and I'll be honest and tell you, I graduated back in 1977. So the word shelter was never ever even mentioned in the program. And so I fell into shelter medicine, or working for a shelter. I couldn't even call it shelter medicine, purely by accident. And for a variety of reasons, I had decided not to practice veterinary medicine when I graduated, despite the 7 years of struggling, partly because I had developed asthma and I was allergic to horses at the time, but the doctors told me, you're going to be allergic to dogs and cats. And I just felt like, how much more do I want to invest in this if I'm not going to be able to practice for a very long time? And asthma back then, we didn't have all the great drugs we have right now. So asthma was really a big deal. And after you have one near fatal attack, it scares you. But when I decided I wasn't going to be a vet anymore, and excuse me, I have like a frog in my throat that just keeps coming. I have to keep clearing my throat. My mentor was a veterinarian. He was a private practitioner, and he had the contract for overseeing the veterinary care of the animals in the shelter. And I had gone to the shelters, and they were just terrible. But when I graduated and told him I'm not going to be a vet, I have to figure out what to do with the rest of my life, he said, well, while you're doing that, I want you to come and work at the shelter and help me, provide better care. And I was totally against doing that. I was just like, I had been to the shelters. I'm like, I don't even see how I could make a dent in this problem. But he said, I'm going to support you. And we have the support of management. And this was the New York City animal shelter system, which was huge. And we had like 5 different shelters with massive amounts of euthanasia going on. And I thought, well, I can do this for a while. And he convinced me by saying, if you don't like it, just quit. But you're not doing anything right now. So let's give it a shot. So it was really supposed to be a temporary option. But once I got there, I really liked working with these homeless animals that other vets just shunned. Nobody really seemed to care about these animals except the people working in the shelters. Veterinarians didn't work there. I was told that it was a waste of my Cornell education working with these animals, and the only vets that worked in shelters were retired or old or just couldn't make it in the real world. So I liked doing something that nobody else wanted to do. And there was pressure, but not the pressure that you encounter in private practice in these one-on-one encounters where people are paying you and, you don't know what's wrong with the animal. I liked this. And so I ended up working for the ASPCA for 42 years until I retired. So.
Wow, Lila, it's amazing to see. And I think there are a lot of veterinarians out there that feel the same. And then especially in Brazil, because I feel that we are in the same, like, it's the same scenario that you were before. So, yeah. Okay, a little bit like, okay, with more knowledge, but the point is the situation is very similar to what you're just explained to me. Yeah, and that's amazing. So I'm going for the second question. What stories could you tell us that inspire you to work to change the way animals are treated in the shelters?
Well, I think the key was being able to try things and seeing what worked and what didn't work. And this great sense of satisfaction you get when you just make a little change and you see a difference. So working in the shelter was not just about treating injuries and illnesses, because we didn't have a big budget for that. But it was this all-encompassing sort of task of trying to change the entire system and the way that we regarded animals in shelters. And one of the key points that I always felt was important for us to make is that there's not a shelter animal. There's an animal that's living in a shelter. And a lot of times it's there through no fault of its own. It's not got a health problem. It's not got a behavior problem. It could be that the owner died, the owner's in the hospital, the owner got evicted. So one day you have this animal that's cherished and a member of a family, and the next day there's this stigma attached to it because now it's in a shelter. So I really felt like, why does the animal have worth when it has an owner, but no worth when it doesn't have an owner? It's the intrinsic value of the animal that counts. And so I felt very strongly that we needed to change our perspective on these animals. They're not necessarily stray animals from the street that are diseased and wild and can't be handled. A lot of them are really, really good animals. And so I really wanted to make things better for them. I wanted to, they were frightened. They're in a strange environment. They don't know people. And so let's see what we can do. And each time we did just little changes, like maybe putting a blanket or a towel in their cage, making sure that they're being fed appropriately for their age and their health. It's not like one size fits all. Looking at the housing and saying, we can put animals in certain cages that are bigger, that, are more comfortable if they're older. And so it was making all of these little incremental changes that gives you the impetus to say, wow, that worked. It didn't cost a lot of money. Let's see what else we can do. And so by doing little things, making sure that the cage is kept clean, that the animal is handled gently so that it's not frightened. All of that contributes to alleviating suffering. And that was my big issue at the time when I first got started. I didn't see a way to lower euthanasia numbers because we were euthanizing massive numbers of animals. We had trucks out on the street bringing animals in, people dumping animals at the shelter, and we had very few adoptions. And so you couldn't necessarily make a major decrease in euthanasia numbers. I said, but at least these animals should have a decent life while they're under our care. And so each time we did some little thing, and you'd be amazed at the difference it would be. Sometimes we had all these big water bowls that we would put in each animal's cage, and you'd have a little puppy or a kitten that couldn't get access to the water. So it was really paying attention to each individual animal. And in shelters, because we almost see them like a herd, a lot of times the little individual, things that we can do get overlooked. And when I arrived at the shelter, we had animals in colony kennels. So they were all communally housed. And we would pull out one or two that might be sick or injured or that we think might be adoptable. And we changed all of that. We said, no, if you want to prevent disease transmission, you have to put animals in individual cages. And so we got management to start, rebuilding and converting and remodeling shelters. And so, each little thing just led to, something else that was really useful in increasing the quality of life of the animals.
Thank you so much, Lila. Again, it's so nice to hear all the stories and then hear your perspective and then what you went through to have all these ideas is amazing. I'm so really, it's such a great opportunity for all of us. And then I'm going to the third question right now. In Brazil, shelter medicine is a very new field, and few veterinarians know about it. Could you tell us how shelter medicine differs from private practice?
Well, that's a question that I've struggled with. Traditionally, veterinary medicine is kind of divided into large animal medicine and small animal medicine. And so in large animal medicine, it's herd health principles of disease control, and it's based on the economic value of the animal. So, a lot of times we're not making big changes for the herd. If there's a disease outbreak, we're going to cull or euthanize those animals. With small animal medicine, it's not based on the economic value of the animal. We know that because we have people spend thousands of dollars on an animal what's the economic value of that animal? It's more the emotional value. It's the human-animal bond. And so when you look at herd health management and small animal individual practice, you recognize that shelter medicine doesn't fit into either one of those categories. So you had to find a way to use the principles of herd health management and yet superimpose small animal individual, practice methods and techniques that would be acceptable to society. So, for example, when you get a disease outbreak in a large animal herd, typically you euthanize all the animals, you close the herd down, and then you test and admit disease-free animals. Well, we can't do that in our shelters anymore. We used to do that, but society doesn't accept, or they're very unhappy when they hear that the shelter had an outbreak of upper respiratory and euthanized all the cats, because these are not deadly diseases. When you think about some of the disease outbreaks we get in shelters, like ringworm or a respiratory infection, in a private practice setting, you wouldn't recommend to an owner that they euthanize their cat because it's got ringworm or because it's got, upper respiratory. But in a shelter, that can be a death sentence. So we really had to look for ways for veterinarians to be able to work with shelters in a way that sort of maximize the use of both kind of principles. And so when I'm a private practitioner and you bring your dog in and it's got parvo, I'm just going to treat that dog. I get one dog in a shelter with parvo, and then that brings into a range a whole different set of protocols that I have to put in place. And as a private practitioner, I wouldn't know what those were. It really is very different. And I just wanted to show you, this is the textbook Shelter Medicine for Veterinarians and Staff. This is the second edition. And we did this one in 2013. And the first edition came out in 2004. And just if I read you the table of contents, that kind of gives you an idea of the breadth of what we have to look at in shelters. And certainly we're doing a lot of data management. You know, we're looking at, you know, how many animals are coming into the shelter. Can we look at what happened last year? Can we make predictions? Can we look at what's the shelter's capacity for care? Like, how many animals can this shelter realistically take care of and provide the minimum standards of care that we've come to expect in shelters? We have shelter design. You know, what's the best way to set the shelter up? What are the construction materials that you want to use? We have sanitation protocols. I mean, I didn't learn anything about sanitation when I was in vet school. If you asked me what's the best disinfectant to use to kill parvo, I wouldn't necessarily know. And parvo is like a real problem in shelters. So we really need to be careful about that. And some of the disinfectant manufacturers are making false claims about that their products will kill parvo. And we've got studies that show that it really doesn't. So we've got to look at sanitation. We've got to look at quality of life, stress, and emotional pain in animals in shelters, because we know that stress is a key component of disease. You know, so I wouldn't know as a private practitioner, what are some things that I can do to lower a shelter animal in a shelter, his stress? What can I do? And, you know, sometimes just providing toys and making sure that, you know, they're not subject to loud noises and bright lights and things like that. Those are things that we don't really learn as individual practitioners. And then just to kind of cut that short, we have a whole section on infectious diseases, how to manage them, how to diagnose them, how to treat them, because we're not going to use the same protocols that a private practitioner might use. You know, I'm not going to recommend in a shelter that you give an antibiotic 4 times a day, because it's just not, you know, you don't have the staff to do that. So I might have to use maybe, you know, a antibiotic that's not your first choice, but one that I know can be given twice a day. You know, are there things that we can do with ventilation and sanitation that are going to help us with diseases? We have a whole section on animal cruelty and looking at forensics, because shelter veterinarians are involved with cruelty investigations. And so it's important that they understand how to recognize the signs that an animal's been deliberately abused. And then if law enforcement gets involved, and I don't know where things are in Brazil. I know, as I said, Jyoti Robertson has been there lecturing about veterinary forensics, and there's this huge link between animal abuse and human violence. And I know that that's a big topic in Brazil, and shelter veterinarians are better versed in dealing with it than individual practitioners. We've got situations with animal hoarding and animal fighting. Again, shelter veterinarians will be better educated about those issues. And then there's emergency medicine in the shelter. You know, what are the things that we're going to do a little bit differently from the veterinarian private practice, who's got all kinds of, you know, tools at his disposal, whereas a shelter might not have that. And then foster care and euthanasia protocols. So behavior is a huge area. You know, how are we going to evaluate these animals to the best of our ability to try to make sure that we're not putting dangerous animals back out on the street when we adopt animals out? And then there's a whole area of spaying and neutering, which in some communities in the United States, it's mandatory for shelter animals, because we don't want, you know, people breeding animals and then bringing more unwanted animals to the shelter. And so we sort of pioneered techniques to do large numbers of animals very quickly, but also safely, and doing them at a younger age. You know, we've been looking at the statistics and the studies about what's the best age to spay and neuter animals. But for shelters, we try to do them as young as possible, because we don't want them to go out there and breed after we've adopted them out and then have their offspring come back to the shelter. So it really is a fairly huge field with a broad, you know, a range of topics that make up shelter medicine that, again, a large animal practitioner would know and a small animal practitioner would know. Let me just, sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lila. Again, that is amazing to hear this. And I think my colleagues in Brazil will be really happy to know about it, because for us, it's so hard to know more about this field, because of the literature, your book is in English. You don't have translated in Portuguese. That's I think is you need to start like looking into, because this book is the one of that's all the time you go and then check what is going on is really good, and then we need this information in Portuguese, because is a huge barrier when you talk about only having this kind of very good material in English. And then when you showed the book, I thought, oh my God, we need this book in Portuguese.
Yeah, it take a lot of work to translate it, though. It's quite a massive volume. And when we wrote the first book, I didn't write the book, I just edited it. So we recruited several people to do it. And when we started out, the vision was a much smaller book. And as we sat and looked at, no, we need to talk about this, we need to talk about this. And, it evolved into this sort of massive text.
It's really, really important. And I think they are like writing and then one thing about the shelter medicine, a book that should be, I think, launched this year. But it would be really good to have other sources too. And then I think it is amazing. And now I'm going to the fourth question that you already say some of the top one of the, you said some of the answers, you said already some answers already, and then, but I think it would be interesting to I think you talk more about it. How has shelter medicine changed the lives of animals in the US?
Yeah, I think I have alluded to that. I think, shelter medicine has really not only improved the quality of lives, of animal lives, but it's also saved the lives of countless animals living in shelters. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, when I got started, we were doing massive amounts of euthanasia, not just in New York City, but across the country. And it's not totally attributed to shelter medicine, but certainly I think we've played a part in reducing the amount of euthanasia, because now instead of, if you get, a couple of cats in a shelter that have upper respiratory infection and saying, well, we've got to euthanize all of them, we can very selectively, treat those animals. One of the things we like to do is get them out of the shelter and into a foster care situation where, again, if they're less stressed and can just get some individual tender loving care, those animals will recover. Whereas in the shelter where they're continually stressed, so we're saving their lives by doing things like that. And it's raised the value of animals that come out of shelters, because before, as I said, a shelter animal has the stigma attached to it. There's going to be a problem. It's going to be a project. Now, when you have shelters with veterinarians that examine the animal, they vaccinate them, they deworm them. In some cases, they're spayed and neutered. They may be tested for feline leukemia and FIV, sometimes even for heartworm disease, and they've been treated. You're putting a much better so-called product out in the street. So now when somebody sees a shelter animal or sees a family with an animal and they ask them, where'd you get this dog from? Oh, I got it from the shelter. They're much more likely to go to the shelter. So that word of mouth also promotes the value of getting an animal from a shelter. And that helps save lives as well. So I really think shelter medicine has made a fundamental change in how not just veterinarians, but society in general sort of looks at animals coming out of shelters now. And there's a big push to ban the sale of pets in pet stores. We're trying to get people to move to getting an animal from a shelter and realizing that you're saving an animal's life when you do that. A lot of times in some shelters, we have a lot of shelters in the United States that are private shelters. So they do a lot of fundraising on their own, and they have incredibly beautiful shelters. But a lot of shelters are still, funded by the municipality. They don't have a lot of money. And so, they sort of struggle. But again, when people can see that you can go to a humane society, that you can go to the city shelter, and that if that animal is sick, that, the shelter will try its best to provide care for that animal so you don't have to pay out of pocket to do that. So I think all of that has gone to raising the value of animals in shelters and to keeping animals out of shelters. Because one of the other things that we try to do is keep the animal in its home. I mean, a lot of animals get relinquished because they get sick. The owners can't afford the veterinary bill, and so they give it to the shelter. And the shelter either has the option of treating the animal if they have those resources, or they're going to euthanize the animal. So we're really trying to help animals stay in their homes. And so shelter medicine is not just about taking care of the animal in the shelter. It's also about educating the community and trying to find ways to help keep that animal in its home.
Great, Lila, thank you so much again. And then I'm going to go for the next one. And what were the challenges that you and other veterinarians face in implementing shelter medicine as a new field?
Well, it was tough. I put it that way. Now that shelter medicine is a board certified specialty, we have overcome some of the stigma that was attached to it, and trying to convince organized veterinary community like the AVMA and individual veterinarians that this really is a specialty. Because people will say, well, the question that you asked me, well, why isn't it any different from, just individual, private practice? And that's, one of the values of the textbook is to say, these are all of the topics that you as a private practitioner don't know, and you as a large animal, vet may not know. So, we had to convince folks that, this really is a specialty field. And it was important to do that because that also encouraged universities to start programs and to start doing research. So we've got research on behavior enrichment. What type of music can you play in a shelter that's going to, lower their stress levels? It's all that kind. We have research now. It's not just anecdotal information. But that was, the importance of becoming a specialty area. But we still have a lot of challenges. I mean, I don't want you to think by any, means that we've overcome the battles. We still have a lot of shelter managers and shelter workers who don't trust veterinarians, who don't want to implement some of the changes that we're recommending because, a lot of times people don't like change. We've always done it this way. Why should we do it this way? And as we introduce more data-driven protocols and saying, listen, we can actually predict how many animals may get adopted based on the numbers over the past several years. And so we now know that instead of placing 40 animals for adoption, we may actually do better by only placing 20 because those 20 will get a home. So it's like looking at what are people, it's data analysis that helps us. And a lot of people are afraid of data. I have to admit, I'm afraid of data. So, but so it's looking at why was it important to make this distinction and to get the veterinary profession on board with us, and then to try to reach out to shelter managers and shelter workers and say, no, we're trying to help alleviate problems. We're trying to address the problems that we know the shelter has and bring some science into the discussion rather than, well, this is, we know this is going to happen because it's happened every year. Well, maybe, but where's the data to support that? Many shelters have very low budgets. They don't have a lot of money, so they can't hire a shelter vet. So they may in fact ask a local practitioner to help them. And that practitioner who doesn't have the skills may in fact rely on some of the protocols that may result in more animals actually being euthanized than needs to happen. And so we're working with low budgets. But on the other hand, we've got some shelters that, especially the ones that are privately funded and that are humane societies, they have huge budgets. So they have a staff of shelter veterinarians, which is ideal, but certainly not what most shelters can afford. And then it's difficult to get some of the veterinary colleges to fund shelter medicine programs. Most of them love the programs, and there's a big demand for those programs, but they don't have, the colleges are challenged. You think they have these huge budgets, but there's so many, different places that they have to spend that money that they're still sort of on the fence about whether they want to spend it on shelter medicine. And so a lot of these programs have to get private funding, which can, really be difficult. So that's still a challenge as well. But, I've said to every dean of a vet college that I've ever met that every, veterinary college should have a relationship with a shelter. because that's a win-win situation where the students get to get hands-on practice on shelter animals. And you see everything in shelters. So you're going to see skin diseases and traumatic injuries and diabetes, you name it, you'll see it in the shelters. And the students get, firsthand, opportunities to work on those cases, so, and then the shelter animals get the care. So, that would be great, but we haven't gotten there yet. So, it's going to take some time.
Yeah, that is amazing. Thank you again. And then I'm going for the next question. You already mentioned, in your other answers about this issue. I'd be also interesting to have you talk and then and also talk more about this. For us Brazilians, the word shelter has a bad connotation, and it's associated with an idea of animal shelters as dirty and dark places where most animals you end up euthanized. Have you faced a similar situation in the US? Do you believe that veterinarians can play a role in changing the meaning of shelter to have a more positive association?
Yeah, I think we are key to that process. And, as I mentioned, in 1977, when I went to work at the shelter, I was just appalled. It was like chaos, just animals in colony kennels, virtually very little veterinary care. If an animal had even a minor injury, it just got euthanized right away. And, veterinarians are a well-respected profession, and we have the expertise to make a change. So, and there are many shelters in the United States that are still in that condition. Okay, that they're dirty and just dismal, dark places. I would just say simple things like, make the shelter clean so it doesn't smell. Use the correct disinfectants. You've got to clean appropriately and enough times. You can't just clean an animal's cage once. If that animal defecates in the cage, you don't wait 24 hours to clean that cage out again. Not only benefits the animal to be in a clean cage, but it reduces the odors. And that's what a lot of people, they go to the shelter and they, oh my God, it stinks. It stinks in here. It's like cleaning up the animals if they come in and they're filthy, and they're just giving them a bath. There's so many things that if a veterinarian comes in and says, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to change the disinfectant you're using, you need to increase your ventilation. If that means if you can't increase the heating and ventilation and air conditioning system, you may need to use fans. And what's the appropriate use of a fan? You don't want the fan blowing directly on the animal. It's a lot of these little things that just make the shelter a more desirable place to go. And some of the shelters I've been in have just been amazing. I went and visited a shelter in Europe. It was actually, I can't remember exactly. It was in the Netherlands. And I was like, this place is so clean, I could live here. You didn't smell anything. The animals, all had these big enclosures. They were well cared for. They were certainly approachable and adoptable. And, there's veterinarians that are, essential for that process. And sometimes, it has to be mandated. You have to say, we took an oath to alleviate animal suffering, to improve animal welfare. I can't come in the shelter and not say to you, you've got to change this. And those changes are going to reap so many benefits. When people come to the shelter and they say, oh, this place is nice. And I saw a lot of, nice looking dogs. I saw a lot of kittens, puppies. I would come back here and I would go and tell my friends, that this is a nice place to go. And the other thing that veterinarians can do in addition to just increasing improving the healthcare of the animals and just improving the physical plant in terms of, ventilation and sanitation and all of that, is they need to talk to their clients, and encourage their clients. If their client is saying, I want to get a puppy for, my child, encourage them to go to the shelter. And you're going to feel better about encouraging them to go to the shelter if you've actually been to the shelter and know that they're vaccinating, they're deworming, they're screening, and saying to the person, if you get a pet and he's got a health problem, bring him to me and I'll work with you at maybe a reduced fee to, address that animal's health problem. So we need to tell our clients to go to shelters, and we'll feel more comfortable doing that if we ourselves go and visit the shelter and volunteer. As I said, shelters don't have big budgets. So, a lot of veterinarians, they're looking for volunteer opportunities to help out in the community. We're some of the other things that we're looking at are like low-cost spay-neuter clinics. And, private practitioners, they get into such an uproar about, unfair competition. People will come to you because it's cheaper. And we're saying, but these are people that aren't going to come to you because of what you're charging. So we're not stealing your business. We're just doing one procedure. And here in the States, we've done all kinds of surveys of people that are using low-cost spay-neuter, services that shelters offer. And we find that they've never been to a vet before. So now we direct them once they come in and they get their animal spayed and neutered, and we get a chance to talk to them. Then we say to them, when you have health problems, go to your local practitioner. And so, veterinarians can also partner with shelters to say, we're going to do like a free exam for the first 2 weeks after the person gets the pet. And then we'll work with you, to try to alleviate some of the cost of the veterinary care that, people can't afford. And so I think there's a lot that, veterinarians can do to improve the image of not just the image of shelters, but, the shelter itself.
That's great. I believe that this is huge. That's a huge, how can I say that? Your answer inspires so much because there are so many ideas that
there's
so many things that you can do together. And it's I think I know that I can see all the students that are going to hear you. They're going to start bubbling the ideas and then be, oh my God, I can do this. And then see you doing this, all the struggle that you went through, and then all the ideas that you start having in those scenarios make a huge difference today. And it's amazing.
It's important for us to recognize that, when we became veterinarians, we didn't become veterinarians to just have to help animals who have owners who can pay for their care. Our oath says we want to alleviate animal suffering and improve animal welfare. So that includes animals in shelters. And it used to frustrate me so much when we would adopt out an animal that was apparently healthy on the day that we adopted it out. We know about incubation periods, and maybe 3-4 days later, the animal comes down with kennel paw for some other infectious disease. And private practitioners would just say to people, well, just take them back to the shelter and get another dog. And I'd say, why don't you try to save that animal's life? Because if they bring it back to the shelter and it's sick, it's probably going to be euthanized. So instead of that, work with people. That's what your oath says you're going to do. And I'm not even saying, we can't afford to do that because we've got bills to pay. And a lot of these things that shelter animals have are problems like upper respiratory infections, or you can just give them some antibiotics, or it could be something, a skin disease, or they're not things that are going to incur major costs. So don't just ship that animal back to the shelter. This person has adopted this animal. It's bonded with the animal enough that it's coming to you for care. So let's see what we can do to help save that animal's life and keep it in a loving home.
Thank you so much, Lila, again. Now I'm going to ask you the next question. What are the benefits of having veterinarians train in shelter medicine for animals and for the community?
Well, that I don't think people recognize, and I think even veterinarians don't recognize that in addition to improving the lives of animals living in the shelter, that shelter veterinarians are involved in public health, issues. So we're involved with disease surveillance. We're involved with managing disease outbreaks, and that we are involved in participating in animal cruelty investigations. There's so much more to it that spills over into the community. We provide education and training programs for pet owners and for shelter workers. We're providing low-cost spay, neuter, and veterinary care. Again, a lot of these things are for the community, because, particularly a lot of times the disease outbreak starts in the shelter because an animal in the community was admitted to the shelter and started the outbreak, and vice versa. Sometimes we will adopt out an animal and inadvertently adopt out an animal that's got a disease. And so we're like kind of on the front lines of trying to control those disease outbreaks to make sure that they don't spill over into the community, or identifying the source so that we can make sure that, we don't get disease spread. And, again, the animal cruelty investigations, shelter veterinarians are trained to do forensics and to work with, the police. And it's a huge issue with the link between animal abuse and human violence. And so that's something that we should all know about. And when I taught at Cornell, and one of my classes was devoted to that, and the students said, oh, I didn't know that you'd be talking about that in this class. And I said, well, do you think that understanding about animal cruelty is important? And they're like, yes. And I said, if you weren't taking this elective class, you wouldn't know about it. So it's really important to see that what we do as shelter vets spills over into the community, and doing like public service announcements, get your animals spayed and neutered, talking about animal cruelty, talking, a lot of legislation to protect animals has a lot of times come from the shelter community. And we're talking about, not having animals locked up in hot cars, and not allowing animals to ride in the back of pickup trucks where they're more likely to get injured if there's an accident. A lot of the stuff that the community benefits from has been initiated, from shelter medicine and veterinarians who have a heightened awareness of these issues because they have worked at shelters.
Thank you again, Lila. And then the next question is, how do we envision our profession and shelter medicine in the future?
Okay, that's the toughest of all the questions that you're asking, because my knee-jerk response is, I haven't got a clue. When I got started in this whole business of working with animals in shelters, I didn't have a vision for the future. I didn't foresee teaching a class at Cornell and having that take off, and having UC Davis start a residency program and all the other colleges. I hoped that would happen, but I didn't know. And I think veterinary medicine is kind of at a crossroads right now. We have a shortage of veterinarians, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. And so we're not sure how we're going to address that. The cost of a veterinarian's education in the United States is very high. The cost of veterinary care is very high. And I'd like to see, those issues being addressed, so that we can make veterinary care accessible to everyone who has an animal or that has a pet. And so how do we do that? And one of the things, I would tell you what my wish list sort of is, rather than where I'm not going to predict for the future, but I would like to see communities invest more heavily in their shelters, recognizing that the shelter is not just for homeless animals. A lot of other activities take place in shelters. Shelters are doing volunteer programs to train people how to take care of their pets. They may have puppy kindergarten classes, behavior classes, all kinds of community outreach projects to learn about, how to take care of your pet. So the community should also invest in that, because it's a community, benefit that we're seeing. I'd like to see shelter medicine integrated into the core curriculum of the veterinary schools, rather than being an elective that you have to take. So just like you may learn large animal medicine and small animal medicine, I think you need to learn shelter medicine. Just like you would need to know all of the principles of herd health management, whether you're going to be a small animal practitioner or a large animal practitioner. That's part of the core of what you learn. So I would love to see, that happen. I'd like to see more shelter veterinarians running shelters, because, again, when we started out, we were just asked for, vaccination protocols, deworming, medical questions. But when you take the holistic approach at looking at reducing animal suffering, increasing, the quality of life of animals, it's not just about the medical care. The environmental stuff is so important. Behavior enrichment, environmental enrichment, all of those things that contribute to stress reduction. And so a lot of times the shelter vet is sort of relegated to this one little piece of, the whole management thing. So if they're running it, then they have an opportunity to, make more pivotal changes. And I'd like to see a whole nother level of veterinary professional. Like right now we have veterinary technicians and we have veterinarians. I think we need a middle layer. I don't know if you have this in Brazil, but in the States here, we have sort of a middle level between a doctor and a nurse. We have a nurse practitioner and we have a physician's assistant. So a lot of times when you go to get healthcare, you don't see the doctor. If it's a minor problem, you see the physician's assistant. And they're highly trained professionals. And sometimes when I go to the urgent care center, I don't know whether I'm seeing a doctor or the nurse practitioner because they're so good at what they do. Why can't we have that for animals in veterinary medicine? Because I think that would lower the cost. Okay, more people could get those degrees and that would increase access so that, more people could get their pets to the vet. Because right now with the veterinary shortage in some areas, there's no vets within a 50-mile radius, and you have elderly people who can't, get to the vet. You have people that have big dogs that can't get to the vet. You have animals that are scared to death to come to the vet. I mean, there's nothing worse than getting a crazy cat in your practice and you're trying to restrain it. And a lot of times those cats are, more easily handled if they remain at home. Well, every veterinarian can't have a home, practice or, go to your house kind of practice, a house call practice. But if we had this other layer of professionals that they could go and then they could tell people, well, no, you need to go see the vet. This is a serious problem. Or no, this is something I can treat at home. Your cat's scratching at its ears and it's just got ear mites. I can treat that here. You don't need to go to the vet for more expensive visits. So I have a lot of ideas of what I'd like to see happen, but currently I don't know where the profession is going right now with the shortages and with the cost of veterinary care. So we've got some challenges.
It's interesting that you mentioned this, and that in Brazil you have a very different scenario, Lila. Only for you to know, you have more than 400 schools of veterinary. You have tons of veterinarians that graduate every year. And then it's interesting because most of them are going to small medicine. Right. And then that's similar here. The point is you don't have the shelter medicine, and that's a huge amount of people that are not receiving, that they cannot afford veterinary care. And then, but you have a lot of veterinarians, much more than here, have 10 times more schools than the United States. And, but the point is you're not addressing
400 schools. We only have 20. I think we have 28 now, maybe 32.
Yeah.
and a lot of veterinary students here can't find an opportunity to get into a vet school here, so they go overseas. They go down to the Caribbean, they go to the Grenada or to St. Kitts. A lot of them go to Italy. They go all over the world to get that degree. And you've got 400 schools in Brazil. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, this is very new. Of course, when I started, maybe you have like United States, maybe 30 around Brazil. But now you have 400. And I think there's more veterinarians, there are more services. For example, it's much easier to find a place to take your cat to do an echocardiogram. It's much cheaper than here because there are more people trained. However, you still have this problem that you don't have a shelter medicine. This is very interesting. If you don't have, and then there are a lot of people that cannot afford veterinary care.
Right. And so, do you have a lot of shelters in Brazil?
We have, but I think most of them is in a similar situation that you mentioned in the beginning of your interview.
Yeah, because we have, I don't think we actually know how many shelters we have in this country. And we have a lot of smaller rescue groups, foster care groups. And so there's no process where they must register with anybody. So we really don't have an accurate count. And we've been trying to do that for years. We've got a couple of organizations that have been trying to actually get the correct numbers. And, it's a challenge getting that information. But it sounds like with so many, veterinary schools and so many shelters, that there's a lot of, job opportunities out there. So.
There are, but not for people that work with sheltered animals, because you don't have the training. And and what happened, people that, because you don't have, and then you have the same protocol and the private practice that is different, and then makes much more, it's cost prohibitive, use all this tools that you have in private practice bringing to the shelter, because you don't, like you mentioned. But yeah, that's interesting. That's why even though we have so many veterinarians in Brazil, you still need this revolution and put like addressing the education and making sure that people like veterinarians can have the training that they need.
Yeah.
It's the training that you're not, it is lacking, for example. Now, the last question is, what recommendations you give to students and professionals in veterinary medicine who want to work in shelter medicine?
Well, I would advise anybody that's interested in working in a shelter to go to the website of the Association of Shelter Veterinarians. I was one of the people that co-founded that organization back in 2001. And it's just been amazing, just like shelter medicine, the growth of that organization from like a small grassroots group of people that just wanted a way to communicate with each other to now having over 2,000 members in several different countries. And they have a website that has resources listed, because there's some online training that you can get. For example, University of Florida offers online courses in shelter medicine and veterinary forensics. And you also want to look at the various colleges that have shelter medicine programs, like the University of Florida, which I previously mentioned, has a lot of online content. University of California, Davis has excellent resources on their website. Cornell, Midwestern University, Lincoln Memorial, University of Wisconsin in Madison. So I'd say you want to look at those various websites. If you sort of just Google shelter medicine at veterinary colleges, a lot of that information will come up, and you can start reading about, that kind of information. And I think that's a place to start. I mean, if you can go visit a shelter, and I would just say, look at a shelter with the eye for what are some things that I could suggest to make some improvements. Because even if you're not specifically trained as well, like we have board certified specialists, I mean, they go through a very rigorous training process, but I don't think you necessarily have to have that depth of training to be able to do, some of the things that you need to do. So don't feel that you can't work at a shelter because you're not a quote unquote shelter vet. There's a lot of stuff that as long as you know that there are protocols that you can utilize and that you can find those resources online and in textbooks, then you're that much further ahead in knowing that you can reach out. A lot of the universities, if you are working for a shelter, for example, and you get a disease outbreak, some of the universities have outreach programs. Some of the large animal welfare organizations in the United States, like the ASPCA, for example, you may be able to get into a conversation with a shelter vet who can tell you the steps that you need to take, So I would also say that it would be nice if you could get formal training in it, but if you can't, look at those online resources. And then just the baby steps. I mean, when I got started, I didn't have any training, a lot of this stuff, this shelter has parvo disease. I need to know, how do I treat it in the shelter? We now have outpatient protocols for treating parvo, which when I was first of all, we didn't have, I'm dating myself. We didn't have parvo disease when I was in vet school. Okay. When I went to work for the shelter, and we had the first outbreak of parvo shortly after I got there. And we didn't know what it was. We just had all these dogs dying with bloody diarrhea and trying to figure out, what was going on. So I think that, part of what you may need to do is, again, utilize these resources that are available to you if you can't get any type of formal training from the vet school itself, and then reach out to, professionals who can help you. That's one thing about shelter vets. They like to help each other. It can be it's not like so much of a competition. It's just like, wow, this shelter's got an outbreak of canine distemper, and I'd hate for them to resort to euthanizing all the dogs. Let me see if I can help them, so.
Thank you so much, Lila.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all, oh my God, all the words. It's really, it's such for me, it's a huge opportunity to talk to you. I know that people in Brazil, they're going to be with the eyes shining after your talk.
Well, thank you for that. And I would say the other thing is that if they ever go to international veterinary conferences, for example, the biggest one in the United States takes place in Florida, and it's the North American Veterinary Conference. They have a shelter medicine track. So that's a good place to go if you're looking to, maybe combine vacation, you want to come to the United States. And you'll meet shelter vets there who will be happy to talk with you. You'll see the information that they have in the educational programs. And a lot of the other major conferences, they had the European Veterinary Conference that was held in the Netherlands. That's the one that I went to. And I went there to talk about shelter medicine and veterinary forensics. And so a lot of your shelter medicine conferences now are starting to incorporate that information. And if you have, the Brazilian Veterinary Medical Association, or if you have a conference there, you could ask the organizers to invite speakers, to talk about shelter medicine, and that's a good way to sort of get initiated into what, shelter medicine is all about.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think
you're
that's
welcome.
One of the most interesting thing when I talk to people in Brazil, they believe that the United States, is already there, and then everything was okay. It's beautiful. We have
Not
the
so.
Humane Society, and then it's kind of this. They don't know all the struggles that you went through, and
Right.
then that is the beauty. That we needed to start.
Well, you need to start.
Evolved. And yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Lila, for
you're welcome.
for this conversation. Thank you.
I'm honored that you asked me. So thank you again.